By popular request, this episode is going to be all about game design changes I've made in Galactic Chef and the reasoning behind them. But to start, let's take a brief look at an old build from last year, shortly after Steam Next Fest. I think the first mistake here is that the tutorial opens with the recipe planner rather than getting into the action of actually cooking. This screen can also be overwhelming as is, especially when you don't know much about the game yet. The tutorial also doesn't cover as much as it probably should, and immediately afterward you're dumped into a challenge with a lot of criteria and no guidance on how to approach them. So let's start with one of the most important areas of change, the progression. To start, your game is now saved as a career, which stores all of your progression so that a second player on the same machine could start a new career and progress independently. The flow also makes a lot more sense now that you're creating your character once up front and playing through a story, rather than being asked to create your character before every individual contest, although you can still go back and customize again if you want to. The next major change is the introduction of discoveries, things that are explicitly called out once they've been revealed through the judge commentary. The goal with discoverable hidden criteria is to avoid overwhelming you with a long list of criteria up front, but by accumulating knowledge you'll give yourself more ways to push it further and improve your score over time. Aside from accumulating knowledge, you'll also be unlocking ingredients and tools as you progress. As I mentioned last time, I'm adding a bit of player agency by allowing you to choose some of the ingredients that you'll be cooking with. Early on, I considered having a scrolling ingredient rack so that you could have a lot more to choose from within each challenge, but I quickly determined that would be too overwhelming. It would take too long to figure out what you want to use. Decision paralysis can be a real problem, especially under time pressure. I also considered adding a pantry step to the beginning of every challenge, but I thought having that on the clock would again be too overwhelming. But even if it's not on the clock, that tutorial starting with the recipe planner got me thinking that adding more steps before you get to the action and actually cook in the kitchen is probably a bad idea. And of course, I'm also unlocking more tools and equipment as you go, which ties into probably the most important thing here, gradually introducing mechanics over time. This starts in the tutorial where, for one thing, I tried to teach you that there are hidden bonuses by crafting the challenges so that you're likely to discover them by accident. But beyond the tutorial, in the full season of Galactic Chef, I've decided to use the warm-up challenges to introduce new techniques that you can use for bonus points in other challenges. For example, cooking a steak to a perfect medium, or filleting something perfectly without damaging any of the meat. You're not told step by step what to do like the tutorials, but given a goal to figure out yourself and then given feedback by the judges in a challenge where you're not going to be eliminated if it goes poorly. You could replay the challenge as many times as you want to get better at it and then move on and apply these techniques whenever you feel it's going to be helpful. Moving on to the next major area of change, instead of having simply cosmetic kitchen skins, you now travel to different worlds that have different judges and different species have different hidden preferences. And I'm trying to tie together themed bundles of ingredients, challenges, and preferences that make sense together to focus on specific areas of gameplay. Looking at the second tutorial, for instance, on the planet Newball, soup is clearly of cultural importance. I introduced the new mechanic of infusing flavors into liquids, I add some ingredients that could be melted or juiced, all the judges prefer liquid textures, and of course the challenge is all about making soup. In the future with longer contests, spending more time on a world also means you'll get more time to get familiar with that world's ingredients. But beyond the gameplay, I think fleshing out these worlds gives the game more personality, immersion, and a sense of journey. But now let's talk about the challenge aspect of the game, where the difficulty comes from, because in the past that was all about balancing the flavors, textures, and ingredient composition to meet certain criteria, which makes it more of a puzzle game, but the puzzle was a bit too repetitive, just balancing these numbers over and over. Now I've added some things like serving it hot, which isn't that hard once you know to do it, but also, as I mentioned before, cooking a steak to a perfect medium or doing a perfect fillet of a piece of meat. So by introducing techniques, I'm allowing you an open-ended way to get more ambitious, to cram more things into your dish if you want to, and the difficulty setting will determine how much of that is actually necessary to win. I'm going to be scaling the difficulty of the NPCs by basically rejecting dishes that score too well beyond a certain point. Now let's talk a little bit about UI. At the end of each intro cutscene, I've added this summary because it was way too easy to just stop paying attention and miss important details. But also that information is available in the PDA in the kitchen. This is actually a bit of a backtrack. As you may recall, I used to have the ingredients in this PDA with all the simulation stuff to preview how the different techniques will affect it, but it felt far too crowded in this small screen, and that's why I went to the full screen planner. But I eventually realized that some information is more convenient to also have available in the kitchen. One thing I noticed while playtesting the tutorial is it was far too easy to accidentally grab the tastalizer probe when you're trying to take food out of a pan, so I've changed that. You can no longer grab the probe, but it does automatically disappear when you try to put it in empty space, making it a lot quicker and easier to just get rid of it when it's in the way. I've also recently changed the tool hotkeys to the number row because this just made a lot more sense than trying to remember that the squeeze bottle is S and the gravitongs were T, I think. Actually, the T shouldn't be underlined in the tooltip anymore. I'll have to fix that. Speaking of which, I've made a few changes to the tool behavior, most notably the squeeze bottle. I got some feedback that the liquids were not very intuitive, and that was partly because there was no indication of when things were overflowing and spilling, but it was also frustrating to not have any control over the amount of liquid you're moving, so now you have that. And you can see liquid spilling out on overflow as well. The second biggest change is to the hammer, which previously would merge foods, sometimes unintentionally, so now it doesn't. These remain separate objects when they've been smashed. I plan on adding new tools in the future for merging foods together and splitting different substances apart. But you can also see little bits flying off as a bit of feedback that you're actually destroying some of the particles when you hammer too much. In closing, I just want to say that I'm sure some of this comes down to my own inexperience, and that as I keep making games and get more practice seeing what works and what doesn't, I'll make more of the right choices from the beginning. In every art form, you need practice to hone your craft, although I think there's still things that you can't realistically predict until you have a playable prototype. But only time will tell if I'm right about any of that. So again, I'd appreciate your input on what you want to see in the next video, and as always, it really helps me out if you hit the like button, spread the word, and subscribe if you haven't already. And of course, thanks for watching.